The document is catalogued at the National Archives in Kew under reference A VIA 65/799, and its language is the dry, clipped prose of a service desperate for answers. Operational Requirement F.23/49, issued by the Ministry of Supply in the spring of 1947 and formally tendered 2 years later, demanded something the British aircraft industry had never produced: a manned interceptor capable of reaching 60,000 feet within 6 minutes of brake release, sustaining Mach 1.5 in level flight, and carrying air-to-air guided weapons against a target closing at a combined velocity exceeding 1,500 knots. The threat that drove this specification was not theoretical. Soviet long-range aviation, the Dalnaya Aviatsiya, was already flight testing the Tupolev Tu-4, a reverse-engineered Boeing B-29, and intelligence assessments circulated by the Joint Intelligence Committee in February 1948 projected a Soviet jet bomber force operational by 1955. The Cabinet Defense Committee, chaired by Clement Attlee, received these papers with what 1 minute described as considerable disquiet. The problem facing the air staff was geographical as much as technological. The Royal Air Force's existing fighter cover, built around the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire, simply could not climb fast enough to engage a high-altitude bomber before it released its weapon over British industrial centres. RAF Fighter Command's own war games, conducted from the underground operations room at Bentley Priory throughout 1948 and 49, repeatedly demonstrated that a Soviet bomber crossing the Norwegian coast at 35,000 feet would reach Manchester before any British interceptor could establish a firing solution. Air Marshal Sir William Elliott, then Vice Chief of the Air Staff, wrote in a memorandum dated the 17th of November 1948 that the present state of our metropolitan air defence cannot be regarded as anything other than a temporary expedient against an enemy who has not yet acquired the means to test it. The contract for what would become the Lightning was issued to the English Electric Company at Warton in Lancashire under the project designation P.1. The choice was, in some quarters, considered eccentric. English Electric was known principally as a manufacturer of locomotives and electrical equipment. Its aviation division, established only in 1947, had produced the Canberra bomber, but possessed none of the supersonic research pedigree that resided at Hawker, Supermarine, or Gloucester. The man who would lead the design effort was William Edward Willoughby Petter, a Marlborough and Cambridge-educated engineer who had previously designed the Westland Lysander and the Canberra itself. Petter believed, contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy at Farnborough, that the path to Mach 2 lay not through swept wings of moderate sweep, but through a sharply swept delta-influenced planform, with the engines mounted vertically rather than side by side. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough disagreed strenuously. A research paper, authored by Sir Morian Morgan, in March 1949 argued that Petter's stacked engine concept would produce unmanageable thrust asymmetries in the event of an engine failure, and that the resulting fuselage cross-section would generate prohibitive transonic drag. The internal correspondence between Farnborough and Warton during the autumn of 1949, preserved in file AVIA 53/371, runs to nearly 400 pages of increasingly pointed memoranda. The Ministry of Supply found itself caught between an established research institution and a manufacturer who refused to compromise his configuration. The matter was eventually settled by the construction of a research aircraft designated the short SB.5, which would test Petter's wing geometry at lower speeds before any commitment to the production design was made. That decision, taken in February 1950, set in motion the sequence of events that would deliver, 8 years later, the most extraordinary interceptor ever produced by the British aircraft industry. The short SB.5 flew for the first time from Boscombe Down on the 2nd of December 1952, piloted by Tom Brooks Smith, and its findings vindicated Petter's wing geometry beyond reasonable dispute. The 60-degree leading edge sweep, tested initially at 50 degrees and then progressively increased, demonstrated controllability characteristics at low speeds that the Royal Aircraft Establishment had insisted were impossible. The tailplane, mounted low on the rear fuselage rather than on the fin, resolved the pitch-up tendencies that had plagued earlier swept-wing research aircraft. By March 1953, Sir Morian Morgan's department at Farnborough had withdrawn its formal objection to the plan form, though private correspondence between Morgan and Sir George Edwards at Vickers, recovered from the latter's papers held at Brooklands Museum, suggests the concession was offered through gritted teeth. The engine configuration remained the more contentious matter. Petter's solution, born of his refusal to accept the drag penalty of side-by-side engine mounting, was to stack two Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets vertically within the fuselage, the upper engine offset rearward to permit a single bifurcated air intake in the nose. The Air Ministry's Director of Operational Requirements, Air Vice Marshal Geoffrey Tuttle, recorded in a minute dated the 8th of June 1953 that the configuration was an act of engineering faith bordering upon recklessness. The objection was not without foundation. An engine fire in the lower Avon would, the critics argued, almost certainly compromise the upper installation through heat transfer alone. Asymmetric thrust in the event of a single engine failure would be vertical rather than lateral, producing a pitching moment that the elevator authority might prove inadequate to counter. The fuel system required to feed two stacked engines with their separate accessory gearboxes and oil systems would necessitate plumbing of unprecedented complexity within the constrained fuselage volume. Petter's response to these objections was characteristic. He resigned from English Electric in 1950, transferring to Folland Aircraft to design the Gnat, and left the P.1 program in the hands of his successor, Frederick William Page. Page, a quieter man, but no less determined, refined the design through the early 1950s without altering its fundamental architecture. The first prototype, designated WG-760, emerged from the Wharton Experimental Shop in May 1954. It was a stark, angular machine, its silver finish unbroken by squadron markings, its wings raked back at an angle that seemed to belong to a later decade entirely. The man selected to fly it was Roland Prosper Beamont, English Electric's chief test pilot, a Battle of Britain veteran who had already taken the Canberra through its development program and possessed, in the assessment of Air Marshal Sir Dermot Boyle, the rare combination of analytical precision and physical courage that the supersonic regime demands. Beamont had flown the North American F-100 Super Sabre in the United States during the autumn of 1953, becoming the first British pilot to exceed Mach 1 in level flight, and returned to Wharton convinced that the P-1 would prove superior to anything the Americans had yet produced. The maiden flight took place from Boscombe Down on the 4th of August 1954. Beamont's flight test report, filed 3 days later and now held at the Brooklands Museum archive, recorded handling qualities that he described as remarkably docile for an aircraft of this configuration. The undercarriage, retracting outward into the wings, functioned correctly. The stacked Avon installation produced no detectable thermal interaction. The aircraft accelerated through 300 knots, indicated airspeed with a smoothness that astonished the observers gathered on the apron. Within a week, Beamont was pressing the prototype towards transonic speeds, and the Air Ministry's reservations about Petter's configuration began, quietly and without public acknowledgement, to evaporate from the official record. The 11th of August 1954 was, by the standards of the Wiltshire summer, an unremarkable day. The Boscombe Down Meteorological Office logged scattered cumulus at 4,000 feet, surface winds from the southwest at 12 knots, and a tropopause temperature of minus 56 degrees Celsius. Beamont lifted WG 760 from the runway at 15 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, climbed on a northwesterly heading towards the Bristol Channel, and levelled at 30,000 feet. The flight test card, preserved among his personal papers at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, called for a progressive acceleration to investigate handling characteristics in the high transonic regime. Beamont selected military power on both Avon RA.5 engines, watched the Mach meter win through 0.95, and noted that the airframe remained entirely free of the buffet that had characterized every previous British design at this speed. What happened next entered the operational history of the Royal Air Force as a single sentence in Beamont's post-flight report. Mach 1 was passed in level flight without recourse to reheat, the aircraft remaining steady and fully controllable throughout. The understatement was deliberate. No British aircraft had previously achieved supersonic flight in level attitude on dry thrust alone. The Hawker Hunter required a shallow dive. The Supermarine Swift could not exceed Mach 0.98 without structural concerns. The American F-100 achieved supersonic level flight only with afterburner engaged. WG-760, on the dry thrust of two Avons producing approximately 7,200 pounds each, had crossed the barrier with thrust to spare. The Ministry of Supply received Beamont's report on the 13th of August. The reaction within Whitehall was, in the recollection of Sir Cyril Musgrave, then Permanent Secretary at Supply, one of considerable surprise and a certain amount of administrative embarrassment. The embarrassment stemmed from the fact that the Treasury had spent the preceding 18 months attempting to cancel the P.1 programme on grounds of cost and strategic redundancy, arguing that the projected entry into service would coincide with the era of the surface-to-air guided missile. Cabinet papers from October 1953, released to the National Archives in 1984, show that Chancellor Rab Butler had personally questioned whether Britain required a manned interceptor at all. Beamont's flight settled that question in approximately 90 seconds of indicated airspeed. The remainder of 1954 and the whole of 1955 were given over to expansion of the flight envelope. WG-760 was joined by a second prototype, WG-763, in July 1955, and by the 3P.1B development aircraft beginning in April 1957. The P-1B introduced the production standard nose with the AI-23 radar, housed in a conical center body within the bifurcated intake, the larger ventral fuel tank, and the definitive fin shape. On the 25th of November 1958, Beamont took the first P.1B, designated XA-847, to Mach 2.1 at 40,000 feet over the Irish Sea. Britain had become the third nation, after the United States and the Soviet Union, to fly a manned aircraft at twice the speed of sound. The aircraft acquired its name on the 23rd of October 1958, when the Air Council formally designated it the Lightning. Beamont himself disliked the choice, preferring the project name P.1, but the Air Ministry's publicity branch had insisted upon a designation that would resonate with the public. The first production Lightning Mark 1, XM-134, rolled out from the Salisbury Assembly Hall on the 29th of October 1959, its delivery to Air Fighting Development Squadron at RAF Coltishall, scheduled for the following spring. The men who would fly it operationally were already in conversion training, and the verdicts they would deliver were about to enter the squadron diaries. Number 74. Squadron, the Tigers, received their first Lightning Mark 1 on the 29th of June 1960 at RAF Coltishall in Norfolk. The aircraft XM-165 was flown in by squadron leader John Howe, who had taken command of the unit 4 months earlier with the specific brief of bringing the type into operational service. The squadron diary, held in the Royal Air Force Museum's archive at Hendon under reference AIR 27/3127, records the event with characteristic restraint. First aircraft on charge. Pilots commenced familiarization. No defects noted. What the diary does not record is the reaction of the ground crews who watched XM-165 taxi onto the apron. Flight Sergeant Alan Tyler, in an oral history recorded for the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive in 1993, recalled that the noise alone was unlike anything we had handled before. 2 Avons at idle produced a vibration that you felt through your boots before you heard it through your ears. The transition from the Hawker Hunter, which 74 Squadron had operated since 1957, was severe. The Hunter was a forgiving aeroplane, its Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 122 producing approximately 10,000 pounds of thrust, its top speed in level flight a respectable but unspectacular 620 knots. The Lightning Mark 1, by contrast, possessed 2 Avon Mark 200 series engines producing a combined dry thrust of approximately 24,600 pounds, rising to over 30,000 pounds with reheat selected. The thrust-to-weight ratio at typical interception weight approached unity, a figure no operational aircraft in the Western inventory could then match. Squadron leader Howe's first conversion sortie, flown on the 13th of July 1960, terminated with what he later described in an interview with Aeroplane Monthly as the realization that I had taken off, climbed to 36,000 feet, and was already halfway to Holland inside 4 minutes. The acceleration characteristics dominated every subsequent pilot account. Flight Lieutenant Alan Garside, who joined 74 Squadron from the Hunter Operational Conversion Unit at RAF Chivener in October 1960, recorded in his logbook a sortie of the 11th of November, during which he selected full reheat at brake release on Coltishall's runway 22 and was airborne in 890 yards. Within 40 seconds of unstick, he had passed through 20,000 feet. Within 90 seconds, he was leveling at 40,000 feet, with the Mach reading 0.9. The Hunter had taken over 6 minutes to reach the same altitude. The performance margin was so substantial that the existing Sector Operations Center procedures, designed around interception geometries appropriate to subsonic fighters, required complete revision before the Lightning could be employed effectively against the threat it had been designed to counter. The first 6 months of 74 Squadron's operations produced a series of incidents that revealed the aircraft's character. On the 22nd of August 1960, Flight Lieutenant George Black experienced a double reheat extinction at 60,000 feet over the North Sea and was obliged to descend to 20,000 feet before either engine would relight. On the 4th of October, Flying Officer Peter Phillips suffered an undercarriage malfunction during recovery to Coltishall and executed the first wheels-up landing of the type, the aircraft sliding nearly 3,000 feet along the grass before coming to rest with relatively minor damage. On the 17th of November, Squadron Leader Howe led the squadron's first 4-aircraft formation supersonic run down the East Coast, an event recorded by the Coltishall Station Commander, Group Captain Peter Wykeham, in a signal to Headquarters Fighter Command that read simply, "Tigers operational at Mach 1.3. Threat geometry now favors Defender." The cockpit of the Lightning Mark I, and indeed of every subsequent variant through to the Mark VI, was a study in the design philosophy that prevailed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment during the middle 1950s. The instrument layout conformed to specification OR.946, the so-called Integrated Flight Instrument System, which had been mandated by the Air Staff in 1955 as the future standard for all British operational aircraft. The principle behind OR.946 was sound. Present primary flight information through a single attitude indicator displaying pitch, roll, heading, and steering commands on one combined face, thereby reducing the pilot's visual scan in high workload conditions. The execution, in the judgment of nearly every pilot who encountered it, fell some considerable distance short of the principle. The strip speed indicator, mounted vertically to the left of the attitude director, presented airspeed as a moving tape rather than a circular dial. Pilots accustomed to the conventional needle and dial of the Hunter found the tape difficult to interpret at a glance, particularly during high-rate accelerations when the numerals scrolled past the reference index faster than the eye could register. Wing Commander Kenneth Goodwin, who commanded Number 5 Squadron at RAF Binbrook from 1965 to 1967, recorded in his end-of-tour report, held at the National Archives under AIR 2/18254, that the OR.946 system, while theoretically elegant, demands of the pilot a sustained interpretive effort that no previous instrument layout has required, and which becomes particularly burdensome during a Mach 2 interception when the geometry is changing every 3 seconds. The AI-23 radar, designated Airpass and developed by Ferranti at Edinburgh, was the first British airborne interception radar to employ a monopulse tracking system. Its performance on paper was impressive. Detection range against a bomber-sized target of approximately 25 nautical miles, lock-on at 20 miles, and continuous wave illumination for the Firestreak infrared homing missile out to a launch range of approximately 5 miles. In practice, the radar demanded constant pilot attention. The display, presented on a circular cathode ray tube mounted in the upper right of the instrument panel, employed a B-scope format that displayed range vertically and azimuth horizontally, requiring the pilot to mentally translate the presentation into a 3-dimensional engagement geometry while simultaneously flying the aircraft, monitoring fuel state, and conducting radio telephony with the ground controller. The workload was, by the standards of any contemporary single-seat interceptor, formidable. Squadron leader David Room, who served on Number 11 Squadron at Binbrook between 1968 and 1971, described the typical night interception in an article published in the Royal Air Force Quarterly in spring 1973. The pilot is flying an aircraft of extreme performance on instruments alone, often in cloud, at speeds between Mach 1.3 and Mach 1.6. He is operating his radar through a small thumb controller on the throttle quadrant. He is computing fuel reserves against the closing geometry. He is conducting voice communications with Buchan or Neatishead. He is preparing his missile system for launch. The Lightning permits no division of attention. It demands all of it. The throttle quadrant itself reflected the aircraft's twin-engine architecture in a manner that few pilots ever learned to love. Each Avon possessed its own throttle lever, its own reheat selector, its own high-pressure cock, and its own start button. A single engine flameout at altitude required the pilot to identify the failed engine through the engine speed indicators, secure its high-pressure cock, monitor the live engine for sympathetic distress, and initiate a relight sequence whose success rate above 40,000 feet was, according to data compiled by the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down, approximately 60% at first attempt. The cockpit was, in short, a place that punished anything less than total concentration, and the men who mastered it acquired a particular reputation within fighter command that they retained for the remainder of their service careers. The fuel question shadowed every lightning sortie from the moment the aircraft entered service, and it was the single characteristic that pilots discussed most candidly in their later recollections. The Mark I carried internal fuel of approximately 750 gallons, distributed between the wing tanks and a small fuselage cell forward of the engines. With both Avons in reheat at low altitude, total fuel consumption approached 800 gallons per hour. The arithmetic was unforgiving. A full reheat takeoff, a supersonic climb, a Mach 2 intercept, and a recovery to base could be accomplished comfortably within 35 minutes of brake release, but only if every element of the profile was flown with rigorous economy. The introduction of the larger ventral tank on the Mark III, raising internal fuel to approximately 1,100 gallons, and the further enlarged tank of the Mark VI, which lifted the figure to 1,530 gallons, alleviated but never fully resolved the matter. The geographical context within which quick reaction alert was conducted made the fuel limitation operationally critical. Number 11 Squadron, which had reformed at RAF Leuchars in Fife on the 29th of April 1967, before transferring to Binbrook in March 1972, held the Northern QRA commitment alongside Number 23 Squadron at Leuchars and, from 1974, Number 5 Squadron at Binbrook. The intercept geometry was unforgiving. A Tupolev Tu-Ninety-Five Bear D, departing Olenia in the Kola Peninsula and rotating southwest through the Iceland-Faroes Gap, would typically be detected by the Faroes radar station at approximately the moment lightning crews at Leuchars were being scrambled. The intercept point, by the time the lightning had climbed to 40,000 feet and accelerated to Mach 1.3, lay between 200 and 250 nautical miles north of the Scottish coast. Recovery fuel, by the time the visual identification had been completed and the photographs taken, was frequently below 2,000 pounds. Flight Lieutenant Tony Aldridge, who flew Lightnings with Number 11 Squadron between 1973 and 1976, recorded in an account published in the Royal Air Force Historical Society Journal in 2001 that the standing instruction was to break off the intercept at bingo fuel regardless of geometry, but in practice no pilot ever did. You completed the identification, you took the photographs, and then you flew the recovery profile that the fuel state actually permitted, which was rarely the one the operations manual specified. The recovery profile in question typically involved a power-off glide from 45,000 feet, beginning approximately 140 miles from base, with reheat selected only for the final approach correction. Pilots referred to this technique, which appeared in no official document, as high-key recovery. The Victor Tanker Force, operating from RAF Marham in Norfolk, transformed the calculation but did not eliminate it. Air-to-air refueling was first employed operationally by Lightning squadrons in 1965, when Number 74 Squadron deployed to Tenga in Singapore via Akrotiri and Bahrain. The technique demanded considerable skill. The Lightning's refueling probe, mounted on the port side of the forward fuselage, required the pilot to formate on the Victor's drogue with throttle inputs that were inherently coarse owing to the Avon's slow spool response. Squadron leader Tim Nelson, in an oral history recorded for the Royal Air Force Museum in 2004, described his first night refueling over the North Sea as the most concentrated 5 minutes of flying I had then experienced, conducted in formation with a tanker I could barely see, at a fuel state that would not permit a second attempt. The fuel anxiety was, in the assessment of nearly every veteran, the defining psychological burden of lightning operations. The Mark 6, which entered service with Number 5 Squadron at RAF Binbrook on the 10th of December 1965, represented the definitive expression of the lightning concept. Its Avon Mach 300 series engines produced a combined reheat thrust of approximately 34,000 pounds. Its enlarged ventral tank addressed the worst of the fuel limitations, and its overwing ferry tanks permitted deployments to Cyprus, the Persian Gulf, and Singapore that would have been inconceivable in the earlier Marks. It was the variant in which the type's high-altitude performance was most fully realized, and it was the variant whose Mach 2 capability the men of 5 Squadron and 11 Squadron explored with a candor that the official record only partially preserves. The published performance figures place the Mark 6's maximum level speed at Mach 2.27 at 36,000 feet, equivalent to approximately 1,300 true knots. The pilot's notes: AP 101, B 186A, restricted operational use to Mach 2.0, a limit imposed not by aerodynamic considerations but by the temperature tolerance of the canopy transparency and the leading edge structure. Squadron leader Mike Hale, who served on Number 5 Squadron between 1970 and 1973, recorded in a contribution to the Lightning Preservation Group's archive that the limit was, in practice, observed in the breach. 2.0 was the briefing figure. 2.1 was what you saw on the Machmeter when the geometry required it. 2.2 was where the canopy began to discolor at the forward arch. And that was the point at which a sensible man eased the throttles back. The handling at Mach 2 was, by every account, remarkably benign. The aircraft remained directionally stable, the controls retained their authority, and the buffet that characterized many contemporary supersonic types was entirely absent. What changed at high Mach was the rate at which decisions had to be made. Air Commodore Graham Pitchfork, in his definitive operational history of the type published by Pen and Sword in 2007, observed that a lightning closing on a target at a combined velocity of Mach 3.5 was covering approximately 1 nautical mile every 1.7 seconds, and that the available reaction time between radar acquisition at 25 miles and missile launch at 5 miles amounted to less than 30 seconds of useful maneuvering. The verdict that veterans most consistently delivered concerned the aircraft's fitness for purpose against its actual adversary. The Lightning had been designed to engage subsonic and transonic Soviet bombers operating between 40,000 and 60,000 feet. And against that target it was, in the consensus of those who flew it, without peer in the Western inventory. Wing Commander John Mitchell, who commanded Number 11 Squadron from 1974 to 1976, told an interviewer for the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive in 1998 that no other aircraft I have ever flown, before or since, could place me at 60,000 feet behind a bear so quickly and so reliably. Against the supersonic threat that emerged in the 1970s, principally the Tupolev Tu-22M backfire, the picture was less straightforward. The Lightning could intercept the backfire, but only with a margin of fuel and time so narrow that a single error in vectoring by the ground controller would terminate the engagement before launch parameters were achieved. The honest verdict, recorded in countless squadron debriefs and oral histories, was that the Lightning had been built for the war that the Royal Air Force expected to fight in 1960 and remained extraordinarily effective at fighting that war until the moment of its retirement, even as the war itself had quietly changed shape around it. The decision to withdraw the Lightning from frontline service was taken by the Defense Council on the 7th of February 1984, ratified by the Secretary of State for Defense, Michael Heseltine, and communicated to Headquarters Strike Command in a signal dated the 14th of the same month. The replacement aircraft, the Panavia Tornado F.2 and subsequently the F.3, had entered service with Number 29 Squadron at RAF Coningsby in May 1987, and the rundown of Lightning operations proceeded on a schedule designed to maintain unbroken air defence coverage of the United Kingdom air defence region throughout the transition. Number 5. Squadron disbanded on the 31st of December 1987. Number 11 Squadron, the last operational Lightning unit, held its disbandment parade at RAF Binbrook on the 30th of April 1988. The final operational sortie was flown by Wing Commander Jake Jarron in XR 728 on the same afternoon. A low-level pass over the airfield, followed by a vertical climb that veterans present described as the most affecting aerial display many of them had ever witnessed. The verdict that Whitehall received from the men who had flown the type was, in many respects, unwelcome. The Tornado F.3 was a more modern aircraft in every measurable respect. Its Foxhunter radar offered detection ranges and look-down capability the AI.23 could not approach. Its Skyflash missile possessed a launch envelope the Firestreak and Red Top had never matched, and its endurance, particularly with the Hindley refueling probe, transformed the geometry of North Sea interception. What the Tornado lacked, and what no Lightning veteran failed to mention in his retirement reflections, was the raw acceleration that defined the earlier aircraft's operational character. Squadron leader Clive Rowley, who flew both types and later commanded the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, observed in a paper presented to the Royal Aeronautical Society in 2002 that the Tornado was the better weapons platform by every metric the air staff considered relevant. The Lightning was the better interceptor by metrics that the air staff had stopped considering. The metrics in question concerned the time-to-height performance that had originated in Operational Requirement F.23/49, and which no successor aircraft, British or American, ever surpassed. A Lightning Mach 6 at full reheat could reach 40,000 feet in approximately 2 minutes and 30 seconds from brake release. The Tornado F.3, configured for air defense with 2 Skyflash and 4 Sidewinder, required approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds to achieve the same altitude. Against a subsonic bomber penetrating the United Kingdom air defense region from the north, the difference amounted to roughly 50 nautical miles of advance, warning that the older aircraft had provided, and the newer one could not. The strategic calculus had changed. The Soviet bomber threat had diminished, and the standoff missile had reduced the value of the deep interception. The Lightning's particular virtue had become, in the cool language of operational analysis, less relevant than it had been. The men who flew it, however, were not analysts. Their judgments, recorded across hundreds of oral histories now held at the Imperial War Museum, the Royal Air Force Museum, and the Lightning Preservation Group's archive at Bruntingthorpe, returned with remarkable consistency to a single observation. The Lightning was the aircraft in which they had been most completely tested as pilots, in which the margins had been narrowest, in which the consequences of inattention had been most immediate, and in which the rewards of competence had been most clearly evident. Air Marshal Sir Frederick Sowry, who flew the type as a young flight lieutenant on Number 74 Squadron, summarized the verdict in his memoirs, published in 1996. Whitehall buys aircraft on paper. Pilots fly them in weather. The Lightning was the last British interceptor that genuinely belonged to the men who flew it. And that is why those of us who did remember it, as we do,